Ched Myers. We've now come to the point in the Sabbath Economics program where the rubber meets the road. Often people of faith who are really grabbed by the vision of Sabbath Economics will ask, so what do we do? What practical steps can we take? That's the focus now of our fifth segment. And to help us work through to a very specific practice of Sabbath Economics, we've invited Andrew Loving from Louisville, Kentucky to join us. Andy is a certified financial counselor with Just Money Advisors, and he's going to talk to us about the promise and prospects of community investing.
Our experience in doing these workshops and working together, especially on the household covenant, is this area of surplus capital is really the one that most people have thought about less and probably have less knowledge about. So we're going to talk about surplus capital. So I guess maybe the first thing we should do is figure out what in the world is it. It is, in some sense, the money we have in our checking accounts and our bank accounts, our savings accounts, our IRAs, our pension plans, 403Bs, 401Ks, any investment kind of account or deposit account in a bank or in any kind of investment, that's surplus capital. It is money that we're saving for health care in our old age, money to send our kids to college and grandkids to college. It's the inheritance from Aunt Dorothy or Grandpa Jack or whoever it is. That's all surplus capital. The reality is that most of us probably, if not every one of us in this room, have some surplus capital. And the very fact of that we have to continually remember is that makes us part of what would have to be characterized as the very wealthy of this world. So, as the very wealthy of this world, what we heard this morning about Sabbath economics, our job is to figure out ways of redistribution. While acknowledging most of us that we have wealth, we also are going to have to probably admit that most of us in this room are not going to give away all of that surplus capital. However much Jesus may have invited us to do so, we're just going to face it, we're not going to do it. So the question for us, though, today is how can we take that surplus capital and begin to look at how we treat that money that we deposit, invest, and handle it in such a way that it can in some ways support or move us in the direction of actualizing those Sabbath economics axioms that we talked about and Ched talked about this morning. I think, again, we're coming into a time in which we have to face the reality is that for too long, the church has all too often, almost exclusively, focused on giving as the exclusive stewardship tool for Christians to use when they want to express their Christian financial stewardship, or even to, quote, help the poor. We know pledge cards, we know stewardship sermons, we know capital campaigns, we know offering envelopes and the like. Most of us probably grew up in churches where education, Christian education about giving was an integral part of what we do. And even giving money to hunger organizations, advocacy groups, homeless shelters, soup kitchens, that for many of us in this room, that's an accepted part of what we know and believe to be good Christian stewardship. But what we're going to try and make a case for this afternoon, though it is an important way, it cannot, in this current world, in this current situation, it cannot be the only way. So we have to begin to use the money we don't give away, that surplus capital, to in some sense to put us on the side of the poor. To use the words of that liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, we have to make a preferential option for the poor. We have to opt for Sabbath economics redistribution. So let's begin to think about that. And I want to talk about two ideas that kind of lie at the heart of Sabbath economics thinking about money or surplus capital. The first idea is that we have to begin to ask the question of not only what is the financial return on our capital, but what is the capital itself doing. Now, when it comes to money, most of us are working under the assumption of what I call the old black box economic system model. Our money goes into a world economic system that we, frankly, in many ways don't understand. And we think of it as going into a black box. We don't really understand what's going on. Or perhaps we don't want to understand it, or we don't care what goes on inside that black box. All we want to know, most of us, and most of the institutions we're about, is how much we're putting in, how much risk we are taking while it's in the black box, and how much we're going to get when the money comes out the other side. We may have some uneasy feelings about what's going on inside the box, but it's a bit too complicated, and we really don't want to try and understand it all. The reality is that for most of our lives, maximum profit commensurate with the risk in the chosen investment is the goal and the only goal. Conventional investing knowledge says nothing else matters. And if we want to do good things, what do? And that is we maximize our profits through our investments, and then we give more away. And this is the way that most Christians and churches in the U.S. have operated for a long time, and how most of them still operate now. It is the American way. It's the capitalist way. Now, while return and profit can and should be one of the considerations in making an investment decision, if we embrace Sabbath economics, maximum profit cannot be the only factor. In other words, we have to begin to look at other things and other factors as we make decisions about what we do with money. We have to begin asking what's going on inside the box and figure out which investments are life-giving and which are not. What investments reflect a Sabbath economics perspective? What are our investments and bank accounts being used for? What does that bank, when we go in and open up a checking account, what do they do with that money? How do they loan it? Who do they loan it to? Does it create decent jobs in my community? Or does it finance corporate mergers? Now, to look at this in a different way, let's look at this illustration up here. Let's say you're interested in affordable housing, and you want to give a gift to a local affordable housing developer. You have $100,000, you wish, invested in a corporate bond fund, and you get an annual dividend on that investment of $5,000. And you donate that money to the local affordable housing developer. You frankly don't worry about what corporations you own in that bond fund. You give the money, you've done a good thing, and supported your mission of supporting affordable housing. But what if you could invest that $100,000 in affordable housing bonds that also paid a $5,000 dividend? You still give the $5,000 to the local affordable housing developer, but the $100,000 investment would also be making affordable housing possible. So in some sense, 105% of your original investment, $100,000 plus the $5,000, would be supporting your mission instead of 5%, $5,000. The exciting news that I can tell you about today is that there is a fund that can do exactly that today, that you can invest in, that your church can invest in, and that a fund that a lot of the work that that fund does is in California. The capital itself and the earnings can in many cases support the mission. Voila, a Sabbath economics investment. One more way to illustrate this point was made by Jed Emerson. And Jed's just a guy who is a part of the social investing movement. And Jed said that foundations who only use the 5% off their earnings, which is kind of what most foundations do, off their endowment to accomplish their mission, is like a farmer from a couple generations ago who would only use the manure from his farm horses to fertilize the field, but never use the horses to pull the wagon, plant the crops, harvest the crops, or ride for fun. The horse in this case was underutilized. And the reality is, that in some sense, that's how we work when it comes to our investments in our churches and our foundations. We only use the horse manure. And instead of using the horse to power and to use all the power of that endowment, and to begin to ask questions of at least how we can begin more and more to use all of that for our mission, we are underutilizing that, and in some sense, ignoring the responsibility of what that capital is doing, which frankly, in many cases, is counterproductive and moving directly against what we're doing. How many of you remember the Nestle boycott on infant formula? We were working on the Nestle boycott and on the infant formula issue. And we talked to a Baptist missionary doctor in Africa who was telling us stories about they were dealing with the issue every day. Babies coming in with diarrhea. All the classic problems that they were having with misuse of infant formula. And so there was the doctor, and we went and looked at the endowment of the Foreign Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention and realized, and they looked, that many of the, it was not only Nestle, but there were a lot of other drug companies doing it. The very companies who were creating the problem were paying dividends that were being used to pay the doctor in Africa who was fighting the very problem that they had created. And friends, that happens all the time. It may not exactly be that, but it's the same kind of idea because we don't ask the question of what the capital itself is doing. Okay, the second idea that we need to embrace is this. Capital deposited in any financial institution is a measure of power. And we have to begin to ask, who are we giving that power to? The institution that gets our investments is given the right to decide who will get to use that capital and that power. Do we give our money or power to institutions that empower the poor or further empower the rich and presently powerful? We must continually remind ourselves that whenever we or our church deposits or invests some money in any local financial institution, we're handing over power. And I think it's not a surprise that most of us would agree that most traditional financial institutions almost never decide to hand over any of that power to the poor or to organizations that serve the poor. Because why? Because their primary emphasis is on maximizing profit. Their only value is maximizing profit, which means that capital flows to the customers who most often are rich or in most situations who will become richer. So we have to begin to decide to be much more conscious about what we do with that money and that measure of power, always remembering, though we may think it's not much, capital deposited in any financial institution. Any financial institution is a measure of power, and we have to begin to take that power back and begin to give it to places and institutions that do things that are consistent with what we're about. In our case today, are they about in any way Sabbath economics redistribution? Okay. So, let's try to begin to look at some practical ways and places that we can put that surplus capital to work for the redistribution of wealth and power. And we're going to do that by looking at, a lot of people call it socially responsible investing. Some people call it socially responsive investing. Some people call it social investing. Some people call it ethical investing. Whatever you want to call it, we're going to call it SRI for short. So what is social investing? And social investing is, in essence, trying to help investors figure out what their capital is doing and to align where they put their money with their social, religious, and ethical values. The modern SRI movement really began barely 35 years ago. Its roots were in opposition to the Vietnam War and apartheid in South Africa, and later the environmental movement, climate change, anti-sweatshop movement, a lot of those things. In essence, social investing is an attempt to try and organize money for social change. Don't always accomplish that, as many times we try, but that's what we're trying to figure out to do. Now, social investing is usually divided into three areas. The social investment community, the SRI community, often talks about a three-legged stool. Now, all three legs of that stool support the overall general kind of thrust of social investing, although it's going to become very clear that, in my opinion, some are much more important than others. So, the first leg of the SRI stool is screen investing. Now, this is probably the most well-known of the three legs of SRI. I also want you to remember it is probably the least powerful tool alone of any of the three legs of the stool. But for most people, it is the entry point to SRI, to social investing. Screen investing includes a number of kind of different approaches. One is the approach of negative screening. And that is being when companies are excluded from investment portfolios because of what they do. What's the good old Presbyterian screens? Alcohol, tobacco, and gambling are the three way long time ago. The Presbyterians, Baptists, and Methodists have been doing that much of social investing for 150 years. But somebody, some point, figured out that maybe the Christian ethic was a little broader than alcohol, tobacco, and gambling. And we actually smartened up a little bit. But those are the traditional ones. And thank goodness Arita talked about that also now for Presbyterians. Weapons contractors also are a part of that. But there's other kind of things now. Polluters, people who produce products with sweatshops, all kinds of different kinds of things. The other half of the negative screens would be negative screens and positive screens. Exactly. And those positive screens result in companies being included for their very specific good things that they do. And that could be that they hire and promote women and minorities, that they have good environmental records, or even produce products or services that help the environment, clean up the environment. Could be companies that develop alternative energies, good companies with good employee relations and have good health care and pension benefits. Selecting and implementing, and we go through a process with our clients to help them select which of these things are more important. The question that everyone always asks, though, is to say, well, but if you screen these things, you're never going to get the same kind of return that people who don't screen are going to get. And the reality is there's now enough academic studies, we know that is simply not true. And you still hear it, and it's kind of in my opinion, right-wing Wall Street that wants to perpetuate that myth, but it is just that, it's a myth. Second one is called shareholder activism. And this involves ownership in a company as an opportunity to influence the behavior and the policy of a particular company. Simply put, shareholder activism is a way to lobby corporations. People who own shares in corporations file shareholder resolutions and instigate company dialogue. And those are the major ways that, in some sense, activists begin to work for change. And there has been progress over the past 25 years. It's usually done in coalitions of interested and activist institutional investors, though individuals have and are actively involved. The more people who have money in SRI products, the people who have those SRI products are involved in shareholder activism. So the more money in those products, the more votes we have when we go to begin to work on issues. And the reality is if you walk into a company dialogue and you represent 100,000 shares, you don't get quite the reception as you do if you walk into that room with 1 million shares. It is the ultimate situation where money talks. And the more money you have, the more you can talk. Now the third leg is the one where we're going to spend most of the rest of our time. And that is the community investing. In community development investing and community development financial institutions, I'll talk about community investing institutions and CDFIs kind of interchangeably. There's some technical Treasury Department definitions to become a CDFI, but CDFIs or community investing institutions are institutions that serve poor communities. And this area is the least well-known of social investing, but dollar for dollar has more possibility for impact and social change than any of the other two. Now, simply put, community investing is capital from investors directed to communities that are underserved by traditional financial services. In other words, poor people. Some of the poor communities are in the inner cities of the United States and LA, and some are in rural communities overseas in Bangladesh and in Africa and around the world. Community development financial institutions help low-income people start small business or buy a home. And buying a home is the predominant way that poor communities begin to build wealth. We've done studies with it, and when you see poor communities begin to build wealth, you see home ownership. So microcredit loans, many of you have heard about that. Microcredit loans that enable poor women in developing countries to create small businesses that provide desperately needed income to feed their families or to send their children to school for the first time. These institutions could be a community development bank, they could be a community development credit union, a developer of low-income housing, an overseas microfinance institution, or a fair trade coffee company. The number of these institutions and the variety of them, we won't even have time to talk about some of the different kinds, like community development venture capital. In this very short period of time, in the last 30 years, there's just been a myriad of new institutions and new mechanisms whereby capital can get into poor communities and begin to enable those communities to begin to build the institutions and the things that they need to become vital and vibrant and independent. Now, financial returns from community investing institutions are sometimes just as good as from traditional financial institutions. And those comparable returns are called market returns. This is especially true of community investing banks and credit unions and bond funds that we talked about. Other community investing institutions, like microfinance institutions, community development loan funds, and fair trade companies may give, not always, but more often than not, give financial returns that are less than traditional investments, and those are called below market returns. In some sense, those below market returns invite us to, in essence, begin to stop worshiping at the altar of the God of maximum return, the ultimate God of our society and our economy, and begin to say that profit is one factor we have to take in consideration, but it cannot and it will not be the only factor. But also for those institutions where you take a below market return, in almost every one of those situations, the social impact of that dollar is greater. So in some sense, we begin to practice Sabbath economics because we're in essence saying, profit's one thing, it's not the only thing. Redistribution of power and wealth into poor communities and to poor people is a greater value, and that's what we're going to do.
My name is Matthew Caldwell. I'm a Presbyterian pastor currently serving in Pasadena, California, and first came across the Sevenfold Covenant and the work around Sabbath economics, household covenanting, back when I was serving a church out in Connecticut. Attended one of the full weekend retreats out there, was very much taken with this sort of stuff, and when I returned to the California area, was a part of several efforts to communicate the information related to Sabbath economics covenanting work in households. Did that on one hand, both by participating in some of these seminars, in writing the book, Sabbath Economics Household Covenant, much of which focuses on my own efforts to work with the material of the Sevenfold Covenant, going from imagining the biblical narrative of Sabbath economics to actually practicing the various areas of the covenant. In my own life, I could talk about each of these areas and where my own story intersects those growing edges. Certainly one of them early on for me in the process was where we had our money invested. My wife and I were the inheritors of some money, and that money was invested. And upon encountering some of this material, learning about community investing in particular, we made gradual moves of recognizing what money we actually had, of looking critically at where that money was placed, and then particularly working with our financial advisor, Andy Loving, and looking through some other resources, particularly getting excited about Oiko Credit. We have been able to move all of our surplus capital into either socially responsible investing or community investing. And that's been it's been a longer process for us. Took us probably 3 or 4 years to make that change complete, but it's very liberating. It was an experience of having this guilt for a long time, for a number of years, around all this money, feeling like though it might not be a huge amount by some standards, felt like a fair amount to us, and yet feeling like it could be doing much more good in the world than it was. So that move has been a valuable one for our household.
Hi, my name's Rick Kidd, and I've been a part of Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries since it's pretty close to its inception. I've been on the board for a long, long time. In terms of the issue of socially responsible investing, that's come about in my journey with Bartimaeus over these years in terms of really being set free from a lot of anxiety and worry about my money and what I do with it, where it comes from. I think for a lot of years I agonized and really felt pretty anxious about money, not only in terms of was I making enough, but where should we give it, how should we invest it. And for many years I invested typically the way most people do, I think, in this country. I tried to find the investments that earned the greatest amount of interest. And because it was for retirement, it was for, you know, our later years, which are fast approaching. And when I began to understand over time how important where that bulk of money that we had to put into an investment, where the principal amount of that, the bulk of that money was going, it began to make sense to me that large amount of money needed to be going to the things that we believed in, the things that were important, not just what the interest was coming off and whether we would give more in our donations, that was really a pretty small amount compared to our overall investment and where that money could go and what good it could do. So this journey for me has been one of sort of going from anxiety and worry about all that to really, I was telling a good friend the other day, I feel completely set free. I don't worry about those investments and whether they're right or wrong. Even in this financial crisis that we're in presently, I haven't felt anxious about it because I know where we put our money is a place that's going to be doing what I've come to believe is God's work. It feels like a faithful commitment, and it's not that we couldn't do better. This is clearly a process of making progress. It isn't about perfection. There are some of our investments that because of regulatory rules and things like that, we can't be in a perfect investment that we might want, but we keep being mindful of it and reminded that our money, what we earn and what we get, is a gift. And I always go back to that Manna story and how powerful that is for me, that this is all gift from God.